Lady Eliza Hawthorne had made peace with her fate approximately 3 weeks after her 21st birthday, following her third unsuccessful season in London, and a particularly tedious conversation with Lady Peaton about the correct way to arrange flowers. The peace treaty she'd negotiated with herself was simple. She would never marry for anything less than genuine affection, and she would absolutely never, under any circumstances, pretend to be stupid to attract a husband. This was a radical position in 1840s England, where a woman's intelligence was considered roughly as desirable as a third elbow. The unfortunate consequence of this personal manifesto was that Eliza had spent the better part of 3 years watching every eligible gentleman in London gravitate toward young ladies who giggled at their jokes, never contradicted them, and possessed the intellectual curiosity of decorative cushions. It was exhausting. More exhausting still was maintaining her composure whilst watching Julian Wycliffe, Duke of Westwick, dance with those same young ladies season after season. Julian Wycliffe. Even thinking his name made Eliza's traitorous heart perform acrobatics that would impress a circus troupe. She'd fallen desperately, hopelessly, ridiculously in love with him during her first season, at a ball where he'd actually spoken to her for nearly 10 minutes about a book they'd both read. 10 glorious minutes during which he'd looked at her, truly looked at her, and discussed Lord Byron's poetry with genuine enthusiasm, not the patronizing tone most men adopted when forced to converse with women about literature. Then Lady Arabella Fitzroy had appeared in a dress that probably cost more than a small cottage, and Julian had excused himself with perfect politeness. Eliza had watched him dance with Arabella, then with the beautiful Miss Catherine Thornbury, then with the diamond of that season, Lady Victoria Sterling. She'd understood the message clearly. A duke didn't notice ordinary girls who read too much and had opinions about everything. That had been 3 years ago. 3 years of watching Julian from across ballrooms. 3 years of seeing him surrounded by the most beautiful women in England. 3 years of carefully maintaining her dignity, whilst her heart insisted on being foolish. She'd seen him perhaps 24 times since that first conversation, always at a distance, always with some stunning creature on his arm, or requesting his dance. And now, this Tuesday morning in March, her mother had announced yet another tiresome visitor to their home in Mayfair. "A very important guest of your father's, darling," Lady Hawthorne had said over breakfast, her tone suggesting this was somehow different from the parade of important guests who'd been traipsing through their drawing room every week for as long as Eliza could remember. "Do wear something appropriate." Eliza had looked at her mother, really looked at her, and made a decision that was either brilliantly rebellious or catastrophically stupid, possibly both. She was done. Done with appropriate dresses that squeezed her ribs until she could barely breathe. Done with having her hair tortured into elaborate styles that gave her headaches. Done with smiling politely at her father's business associates and political allies, whilst they droned on about topics they assumed she couldn't possibly understand. If she had to endure another afternoon of aristocratic tedium, she would at least be comfortable. Which is how, 2 hours later, Eliza found herself standing in her bedchamber, staring at her reflection with a mixture of satisfaction and mild horror. The dress she'd chosen was a disaster. A plain, brownish-gray monstrosity that had been relegated to the back of her wardrobe 3 years ago after her mother had declared it absolutely unsuitable for anything except perhaps scrubbing floors. It hung on her frame like a potato sack that had given up on life. The color made her look vaguely jaundiced. Perfect. Her hair she'd attempted to pin up herself, dismissing her lady's maid with the excuse of a headache. The result was half pinned and half falling down, creating an effect that could charitably be described as recently caught in a windstorm, or less charitably as hasn't seen a mirror in several days. She'd forgotten jewelry entirely. No gloves, no shawl, nothing that suggested she'd put any effort whatsoever into her appearance. Martha, her lady's maid, had actually gasped. "Miss Eliza, you cannot." "Lady Hawthorne will survive," Eliza said firmly, sweeping past her toward the stairs. "I'm properly covered, aren't I?" Nothing scandalous, just unimpressive. That had been the goal. Unimpressive, forgettable. So thoroughly unremarkable that, whatever important guest was visiting, would barely register her presence. She descended the main staircase with her head high, prepared for her mother's inevitable disapproval. The plan was simple: appear for exactly the minimum amount of time required by politeness, say as little as possible, and retreat to the library at the first opportunity. It was a good plan. A solid plan. The plan lasted approximately 4 seconds after she entered the drawing room. Because there, standing beside her father's desk, near the large windows overlooking the garden, dressed in an impeccably tailored dark blue coat that fit his broad shoulders in a way that should probably be illegal, was Julian Wycliffe, Duke of Westwick. The man she'd loved in secret for 3 years. The man who absolutely, positively should not be seeing her like this. Eliza stopped so abruptly she nearly tripped over her own feet. Her hand shot out to grip the doorframe for support. Every muscle in her body tensed, with the overwhelming urge to flee. She took one step backward, then another. Her mother's hand clamped around her elbow like an iron manacle wrapped in silk. "Eliza," Lady Hawthorne said, her voice honey-sweet and utterly terrifying. "Do come greet our guest." Eliza's father, the Marquis of Hawthorne, looked up from whatever document he and the Duke had been examining. His expression flickered through surprise, confusion, and what might have been suppressed amusement. "Ah, Eliza," he said carefully. "May I present His Grace, the Duke of Westwick, your Grace, my daughter, Lady Eliza Hawthorne." This was hell. Actual, literal hell. Julian turned toward her. Eliza watched his expression with the fatalistic calm of someone witnessing their own execution. She waited for polite indifference. Barely concealed disappointment. Perhaps even pity for the Marquis's unfortunate daughter who apparently dressed herself in the dark. What she saw instead made her breath catch in her throat. Julian Wycliffe was staring at her with undisguised fascination. His dark eyes, she'd forgotten how dark they were, like aged whiskey in candlelight, traveled over her disheveled appearance, not with disgust or disappointment, but with something that looked distinctly like delight. One corner of his mouth curved upward into a smile that transformed his usually serious expression into something warm, genuine, and utterly devastating. "Lady Eliza," he said, his deep voice carrying a note of warmth that sent shivers down her spine. He stepped forward and bowed properly. Not the perfunctory nod most men gave unmarried ladies they considered beneath their notice. What an unexpected pleasure. Unexpected? That was certainly one word for it. Eliza's mind raced through her limited options. She could faint. No, too dramatic. Claim sudden illness. Too obvious. Simply turn and run. Also impossible, as her mother still had her arm in a grip that suggested escape would result in public disgrace and possibly permanent injury. She was trapped. Utterly, completely trapped. Very well then. If fate had decided to humiliate her in front of the man she loved, she would face it with whatever dignity she could salvage. Eliza straightened her shoulders and dropped into a curtsy that was technically correct, even if her horrendous dress bunched awkwardly around her knees. "Your Grace," she said. "My father didn't mention we'd be entertaining a duke today. Had I known, I might have dressed for the occasion." The words came out more tartly than she'd intended. Heat flooded her cheeks. Wonderful. Now she was rude and dressed like an escaped scarecrow. But Julian's smile only widened. "On the contrary, Lady Eliza," he said lightly, "I find your attire refreshingly honest." Honest? What an interesting choice of word. "How diplomatic of you, Your Grace," Eliza replied, though she suspected his definition of honest was remarkably generous. Her mother's fingers tightened warningly on her arm. Her father made a small sound that might have been a cough, or a laugh hastily converted into one. Julian, however, laughed outright. It was a genuine, delighted sound that lit up his entire face and did extremely dangerous things to Eliza's composure. "I meant it as a compliment," he said. "Half the ladies in London spend hours preparing themselves for visitors, creating elaborate artifice. You apparently cannot be bothered with such nonsense." He said it as though it were admirable. as though her complete lack of preparation was charming rather than mortifying. Eliza stared at him, trying to understand what was happening. This was not how dukes behaved toward ordinary young ladies. Especially not ordinary young ladies who looked like they'd been dragged backward through a hedge. She started, then stopped, utterly unsure what to say. "Won't you sit down, Eliza?" her father interjected smoothly, gesturing toward the settee near the fireplace. "His Grace and I were just concluding some business. There's no reason we cannot enjoy tea whilst we finish." Tea! Oh, heavens! That meant she would be required to remain in the room for at least half an hour, looking like this, while Julian Wycliffe continued to look at her like she was interesting. Her mother finally released her arm. Eliza moved toward the settee on legs that felt distinctly unsteady and sat, arranging her hideous dress as best she could. She was painfully aware of Julian taking the chair directly across from her. He was still smiling. Why was he still smiling? A maid entered with the tea service, and Lady Hawthorne began pouring with practiced grace. Conversation resumed, Julian and her father discussing agricultural improvements on the Duke's Yorkshire estates, normally a topic that would have bored Eliza senseless. But today, she barely heard a word, because Julian kept looking at her. Not at her dress, not at her hair, at her. She tried to focus on her teacup, tried to calculate the earliest moment she could politely excuse herself and flee to the safety of the library. Then Julian spoke again. "Lady Eliza," he said, interrupting her father mid-sentence about crop rotation. "I recall we once discussed Lord Byron at the Pembridge Ball. Do you still read poetry?" Her teacup froze halfway to her lips. He remembered. He remembered a conversation from 3 years ago. "Yes, Your Grace," she managed. "Though I confess my reading tastes have expanded somewhat beyond poetry." "Oh?" His dark eyes sparked with genuine curiosity. "What captures your interest these days?" This felt like a trap. Gentlemen did not actually want to know what women read. They wanted to hear about romantic novels, or perhaps something suitably domestic. But something in Julian's expression, open, attentive, real, made her answer honestly. "I've been reading quite a bit of philosophy. John Stuart Mill's essays on representative government. Some of Mary Wollstonecraft's work as well." Her mother made a small, pained sound. Her father's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his full attention fixed on her. "Wollstonecraft," he said, "a vindication of the rights of woman. Good heavens, Lady Eliza. Those are rather revolutionary texts for a young lady." Here it came. The polite dismissal, the subtle mockery. "I've read them myself," Julian continued calmly. "Her arguments about education are particularly compelling, don't you think? Though I suspect most of London society would consider us both radical for admitting as much." Eliza blinked. Then blinked again. You've read Mary Wollstonecraft?" "Why do you sound so surprised?" he asked, amused. "Did you assume dukes spend all their time hunting, gambling, and discussing horseflesh?" "Well, yes," she admitted faintly. Julian laughed again. "Fair enough, most of us do. But I find books infinitely more interesting than horses, and philosophy far more engaging than cards." This could not be real. This had to be a dream, or perhaps a fever-induced hallucination brought on by humiliation and wishful thinking. "Your Grace," Eliza said carefully, "are you quite well? You appear to be having an actual conversation with me about books, which, in my experience, is not something gentlemen do." Her mother gasped. Her father looked torn between mortification and laughter. Julian merely grinned. "Perhaps," he said, "you've been conversing with the wrong gentleman, Lady Eliza." The afternoon dissolved into the strangest, most wonderful confusion of Eliza's life. Her father and Julian finished their business, irrigation systems, land management, things that ordinarily would have sent her into silent misery. But every few minutes Julian directed another question to her. What did she think of the railway expansion? Did she believe it would alter English society? What were her opinions on the current political climate? He asked as though her answers mattered, as though she mattered. An hour passed, then another. Lady Hawthorne eventually gave up trying to steer the conversation toward safer subjects. Her father watched the exchange with an expression Eliza couldn't quite decipher. Finally, Julian rose to take his leave. "Lord Hawthorne," he said, "thank you for your time and expertise. I'm confident our collaboration will be most beneficial." He turned to Lady Hawthorne, bowed politely. Then he looked at Eliza. His expression softened. "Lady Eliza," he said quietly, "this has been the most enjoyable afternoon I've spent in London in, well, perhaps ever." Eliza stood, her terrible dress betraying her once again. "Your Grace," she said, "I suspect you're being absurdly kind, given that I look as though I've been sleeping rough in Hyde Park." "I think," Julian replied, his dark eyes holding hers, "you look like someone who doesn't waste time on pretense. It's remarkably attractive." He bowed. And then he was gone. Eliza stood frozen in the drawing room, her tea long since cold, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. What in heaven's name had just happened? Her mother moved to her side, her expression a complicated mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. "Eliza," she said slowly, "what on earth was that?" "I have absolutely no idea," Eliza replied honestly. "I wore my worst dress specifically to be unmemorable." "Well," her mother said dryly, "you certainly failed at that." Eliza barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Julian smile, heard his laughter, felt the weight of his gaze as if he were still sitting across from her, studying her like a fascinating problem he was determined to solve. It was absurd, dangerous, and utterly intoxicating. By morning, she had convinced herself it meant nothing. Men like Julian Wycliffe did not suddenly notice women like her. Dukes did not abandon years of carefully cultivated indifference because a young lady wore a dreadful dress and spoke her mind. He would send a polite note. An apology, perhaps. Some excuse about being called away to Yorkshire. She was still clinging to this comforting delusion when, at precisely 3:00 that afternoon, the butler announced, "His Grace, the Duke of Westwick." Eliza nearly dropped the book she had been pretending to read for the past 40 minutes. Julian entered the drawing room and stopped the moment he saw her, his expression lit with unmistakable pleasure. "Lady Eliza," he said warmly, "I hope I'm not intruding." "You? Of course not, Your Grace," she managed, standing and curtsying on legs that felt perilously weak. Today she was properly dressed, a simple pale blue day dress, her hair neatly arranged, respectable, appropriate, presentable. Julian studied her for a moment, then lifted one dark eyebrow. "You look lovely," he said, "though I confess I was rather charmed by yesterday's ensemble." Heat rushed to her cheeks. "That dress was a catastrophe." "It was honest," he corrected gently, "and honesty, I find, is increasingly rare." Lady Hawthorne made a small, pleased sound from her seat by the window. "Lady Hawthorne," Julian continued, turning to her with perfect courtesy, "might I beg a few moments of your daughter's time? Perhaps a walk in the garden." Her mother looked as though Christmas had arrived early. "Of course, Your Grace. Eliza, take your shawl." 2 minutes later, Eliza found herself walking beside Julian through the rose garden, her mother observing from a strictly appropriate distance. For a time, neither spoke. Then Julian stopped. "I've been thinking about you since yesterday," he said simply. Eliza's heart lurched. "I beg your pardon?" "I'm going to be forward," he continued. "You strike me as someone who prefers honesty to polite evasion." "Yes," she said softly, "I do." Julian took a breath. "For 3 years I've been surrounded by women performing for me, agreeing with me, wanting something from me. Yesterday I walked into your father's drawing room and saw a woman who could not care less about impressing me, and it was the most refreshing thing I've encountered in years." "You mean my dreadful dress." "I mean you," he said firmly. Then, quietly, almost vulnerably, I've been half in love with you since the Pembridge ball." The world tilted. "But you left," Eliza whispered. "I was afraid," Julian admitted. "Afraid of wanting the wrong thing. Afraid of choosing with my heart instead of my title." He met her gaze. "I don't wish to make that mistake again." His hand closed gently over hers. "I want to court you, Lady Eliza, properly, openly, if you will allow me." For 3 years, Eliza had told herself not to hope, not to imagine, not to dream. But standing there, beneath the budding roses, with Julian Wycliffe looking at her as if she were extraordinary. "Yes," she whispered. His smile was radiant. And when they returned to the house, Julian requested her father's permission to call again. Tomorrow. That night, alone in her bedchamber, Eliza pressed a hand to her racing heart. She had worn her worst dress to be invisible. Instead, she had been seen. And for the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, love had found her when she had finally stopped pretending.